Can you imagine the median price of homes in Raleigh hitting $1 million? What about 1.5 million? The San Francisco Chronicle thinks they could. Are they insane? Do they know something we don't know? We're going to talk to some Raleigh builders and developers to find out if they think the future is San Francisco style prices. Last week, the San Francisco Chronicle identified Raleigh as one of 10 cities in the United States who they believe will, in the near future, look a lot like San Francisco in terms of housing affordability. San Francisco is home to Silicon Valley and tech companies the likes of Facebook, Apple, and Google. It's the sixth largest economy in the United States, has historically had an unemployment rate a full point lower than the national average, and hourly wages are $10 per hour more than the national average. And yet, the other big thing that San Francisco is known for is its incredibly unaffordable housing. According to Zillow, San Francisco's current median home value is $1,579,000. That is almost 5 times the median home value for the U.S. as a whole, which is $331,000. I found this property, which is 365 square feet, for $500,000. I mean, it's really pretty and all, but it's not a pretty house. It's a pretty closet. Housing prices are on the rise in most U.S. cities. Cities all over the U.S. are struggling with housing shortages, and with housing shortages come increases in home prices. So what makes Raleigh so special? If most cities in the U.S. are struggling with housing affordability, what is it about Raleigh in particular that has people suggesting we're headed for those same astronomical housing trends as San Francisco? In today's video, we're going to look at the history of housing in San Francisco, and we're going to try to tease apart the issues that have led to such severe housing affordability issues. Then we're going to take a comparative look at Raleigh to see how things are changing here, and I'm going to be looking for red flags for the future of housing in the capital city of North Carolina. First, let's look at the factors they use to identify the cities that they think could rival San Francisco for housing prices. In each of these cities, home values rose 40% plus in the last 2 years. Inventory fell by 40% in the same period, and inventory for sale is now at 2 homes or fewer per 1,000 people population. One of the issues I have with this criteria is that it tells us that more people are moving into an area than moving out, but it doesn't say anything about how the city is dealing with the need for housing. San Francisco's problems have not been only due to growth. Other cities have had more growth and have not had affordability issues to the degree that San Francisco has. Granted, any urban environment is going to be pricey if it's the kind of city people want to live in. There's only so much land. But for example, when we compare New York City to San Francisco, the median home in New York City is half the price of the median home in San Francisco. Somehow, New York City has managed to keep their prices from soaring to the same extent. I realize that mid-700s is not affordable for many people, but for the purposes of this video, I just want to show that urbanization and population growth are not the only factors that influence how high a city's home prices will go. Let's look at some of the other factors. There are 3 things that San Francisco has done that has had a negative impact on its ability to create affordable housing. After we go through these failures, we'll see if Raleigh's doing anything similar or different. Number 1, homeowners have objected to dense building in San Francisco, blocking retail housing developments that would expand on the current supply. The key here is that homeowners have the power to block building of residential development. This might seem like a good thing if you're a homeowner. I hear a lot of this from locals here. The roads can't handle it, too much traffic, too much density. People feel comfort when they have the power to determine what happens on the land around them. However, it does have a consequence. Harvard economist Edward Glazer and Wharton University professor of finance and real estate Joseph Giorco note that binding land use restrictions drove up the cost of land in San Francisco and resulted in a 109% increase in home prices between 1991 and 2016 due to the stifling effect on building. Federal policy reflects these conclusions as well. President Barack Obama's administration released a housing development policy guide in 2016, stating that housing regulation that allows supply to respond elastically to demand helps maintain housing affordability. Number 2, regulations slowed the city's response time to new housing. From 2007 to 2014, San Francisco only approved half of the building permits necessary to accommodate its growth. This was likely due to the increase in land use restrictions and the time it took for neighborhood input into the new developments. Number 3, San Francisco says no to vertical growth. San Francisco is unique in that they're surrounded on 3 sides by water, so they do have much more land limitations than many other cities. What's interesting, though, is that San Francisco is actually about the same physical size as Paris, but rent for a one-bedroom apartment is 30% cheaper in Paris, and Paris dedicates 10% more of its land to parks. Here's an interesting clue as to why that might be. In 2010, when faced with rising housing costs, Paris raised the building height restriction from 121 feet to 150 feet for apartment buildings and a whopping 590 feet for office and mixed-use buildings. Comparatively speaking, San Francisco has a height restriction of only 40 feet for the vast majority of the city. Look at this map. Everything in yellow has that height restriction. That's 2 to 3 stories tall. Obviously, that's a big problem, and honestly, probably one of the biggest problems San Fran has with affordability. There's only so much land. When you run out of it, the only place to go is up. Okay, so what does Raleigh look like in all of these 3 areas? Number 1, does Raleigh allow neighborhood input into housing development? The short answer is yes.
In every town that we work in, it's going to, any type of zoning change or anything like that, you have to have the traditional town hearing, and where existing residents come in and voice concerns or excitement or support or, whatever that may be.
And the long answer is that Raleigh's rules on neighborhood input have shifted in recent years.
Raleigh City Council was one that was anti-development for quite some time. And over the last couple of years, some of the policies have changed.
Every municipality in the Triangle is different, but Raleigh proper has made some adjustments in their development process.
Raleigh used to have the citizens advisory committees, and you had to go in front of the CACs, and they actually voted on your project. And then that vote carried forth with you when you went to the Planning Commission and the City Council in Raleigh. Raleigh City Council disbanded the CACs, or at least their support of the CACs. They still meet, and there is not a requirement anymore to get them to vote on a project.
If a developer wants to rezone a property, they have to go through that neighborhood input process. But unlike in the past, there are not neighborhood groups that vote on the project. Now, this doesn't mean that the municipalities in our area don't ask the builders to address the issues that all of us are concerned about: aesthetics, traffic, and schools.
There's always concerns about infrastructure and, schools and all of that stuff. And it really comes into what comes first, the chicken or the egg, when it comes to, well, we need to build more schools first, or we need to improve or widen these roads first before we can allow improvements in. But the reality of it is the tax base that actually pays for that growth. So unless the town or city can actually front the tens of millions of dollars that it takes to put these things in place, you have to have the rooftops before the rest of the stuff can come in.
When developers want to increase density significantly, that's when neighbors get concerned. Any developments that are more than 5 acres, increase building heights more than 5 stories, or that increase density more than 10 units per acre still require the neighborhood review process. But unlike many of the suburbs, Raleigh doesn't have a lot of land that can support new neighborhoods. Much of the residential construction in Raleigh is teardowns of existing homes.
There are not a lot of City of Raleigh infill new neighborhoods where there wasn't already an existing home. And so a lot of the new construction in the City of Raleigh does take place on the site where there was a home previously. One really important point is that there are a lot of places in beautiful locations, beautiful neighborhoods, very high value locations, but the home that's existing is very small, disrepair, and is not consistent with the norms for the neighborhood.
So, does the neighborhood input significantly slow the development process in Raleigh? It does not appear to be the case, and the builders I spoke with all recognized the importance of neighborhood input and thought of it as a good process.
It's actually good governance, and it's good neighborhood.
And they're trying to balance the need for more new housing with the desire of the existing neighbors to have, a beautiful and livable space. And so I think they've done a good job, and it's a hard job.
So point number 2, how long does it take to get a new home development approved in Raleigh?
You can put a residential, we're talking about a residential project under contract, and probably about 2 years would be the longest time it would take you to get rezoning and approval. But in Wake County unincorporated, you can get it done in 12 months.
It can vary greatly depending on the area, but I mean, honestly, it's roughly a 2-year process, 18 months to 2 years from the time you actually purchase the property, get it through entitlement, get all your final approvals.
In San Francisco, it takes about 5 years for any new housing development to be approved. It's very different in Raleigh. So our longer projects take less than half the time as San Francisco to get approved, and some of our projects take even less time, and we're not short on builders that are working in our area.
23 of the 25 largest national builders are in this market.
But like I said, approvals are different if you're bringing in more dense housing. Now, keep in mind that it isn't just Raleigh's regulations that impact the local housing market. When surrounding towns outside of Raleigh offer affordable housing, it relieves some pressures on the housing market in Raleigh. And unlike San Francisco, Raleigh doesn't have natural barriers to the expansion outside the city proper. It's like 15 minutes to Garner, 15 minutes to Wendell, 15 minutes to Cary. All of these areas provide extra housing opportunities that are commutable and reasonable to work in Raleigh.
Being a 360 city, you know this, we've got projects, people are talking about projects in Oxford again. Granville County is now building. Now you've got Person County, you've got Lee and Sanford, and certainly Johnston County, and now people are going out to Selma. It's going to be a metropolitan, it'll be like Atlanta. It will be a large, very large, sprawled out metropolitan area. And we as an industry will continue to meet the housing needs because the land is there to do it.
What about Raleigh's restrictions on building height? Raleigh does not have the exceptionally rigid height restrictions that San Francisco has. We already have areas where tall buildings are allowed. Different zones have 12-story, 20-story, and 40-story height limits. That provides way more flexibility in development than the 40-foot restrictions in San Francisco. Also, rezoning here isn't as hard as it used to be. There have been developers here who have fought really hard to change perceptions about what building up will do to the culture of the city, making local acceptance of rezoning for building up much more amenable to residents. Before John Kane redesigned a very old and ugly North Hills Mall into a beautiful and modern destination with shopping, food, housing, and recreation all in one place, Raleigh locals were a little suspicious about any kind of rezoning to become more city-like. But the North Hills project has really changed people's perceptions of what modern housing can be, and people are much more open to rezoning projects. North Hills has seen many other similar type developments follow in its footsteps like these. So is Raleigh the next San Francisco?
There are just so many reasons that that's not going to happen because, and mostly it's just supply and demand. And as strong as our demand is and will be, our supply is as we're getting there. So we got a lot of people here who are pushing to produce housing.
If you like this video, you might also like this one where I explain why Raleigh's eastern suburbs are so much cheaper than the ones on the west side.